so many cultures, the oppression of women doesn't take place just by men. It takes place within women, like Chinese foot binding or female genital mutilation. It's not done by the men; it's done by the women, and it's terrible when the whole system is oppressive like
Right now.
that.
We're talking to Gitanjali Kolanad. She is the author of Girl Made of Gold, which was recently published by Juggernaut Books. And I am super excited to talk about this book.
Well, it's an amorphous term that it's used to cover a range of practices, and especially when you say that in ancient culture, it's going back. But I'm talking about a very specific period in Indian history. It's true that there were the tradition of court women or women who were sexually available to men is it's from time immemorial. Like they call it the world's oldest profession for a reason, and so the kind of changing aspect of it is that at one time it might have been a very highly respected profession. You know, there might have been no stigma attached to it, but um, I don't find that in all the reading of literature. There's always some kind of controversial nature of that kind of woman, and so the sexual availability has always been a bit of a problem. And the Devadasi in Tamil Nadu was a woman who was associated with the temple. She did some kind of temple rituals. She was also sexually available. That Devadasi status made her sexually available to high caste men. So it's kind of the conjunction between temple and sex work that kind of forms the crux of the Devadasi. And then the art form is that added layer. You know, she's also an incredibly talented artist, either singing or dancing, and she was highly literate. She was sophisticated. I mean, it's similar to the Tavais of North India and their association with music and dance as well. I want to try to explain it without giving any spoilers. I'm very keen that you know, I'm a huge fan of detective fiction, and I don't I love that genre. So when I thought I would write a novel, I wanted to write it within that genre. It was really important to me. And then the story, as it was told to me, came very naturally. That it could be made into a murder mystery. But then I found that I'm not a novelist by nature. I found it very difficult to write a novel. And it was really, really problem. You know, I had so many problems I can't even tell you. But I had written short stories, and so I started to construct the book in the point of view of different characters, and that was the way I was able to to actually complete the whole story, tell each person's individual story, that rather than trying to weave it all into one kind of linear narrative, which I just couldn't manage to do. I don't know why. Like it was just really hard for me.
That's
So
actually what I loved about it. Honestly, the point of view there, I was going to mention it later. The fact that you had different points of view, and like for the first perspective that you picked, you know, the girl made of gold. You know, she's talking as we're entering the temple. I was honestly clueless for the first chapter. I was like, what is going on? Who is speaking to me? You know, but as it moved forward, small pieces of puzzle started coming together, and that's what I loved about your book.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad because, you know, as a writer, we always think we can write whatever we want, but the truth isn't, it isn't like that. We have to write the kind of book that we can write. And so I had to choose those characters that I was going to tell this, or, you know, choose. It's not true. The characters kind of chose themselves as I started to weave through the story. And so the story is that intersection that's so important in the lives of Devadasis, the priests, the temple, the rich patron, the zamindar, that kind of family, and the Devadasi community, which is it's not uniform. You know, there are Devadasis who are very talented, and there are Devadasis who basically make their livelihood be by their patron. Their patron is the one who pays for their existence, and so I wanted to show that the intersection of the three characters. The novel in terms of of individual characters and individual points of view. I really did do a lot of research on those specific aspects, like temples, temple building, and I love research. It's like I could go on forever doing research. It's just so pleasurable, so much fun, and the things you discover. So I did a lot of work at the British Library, which has a huge East India collection. Like the East India Company collection is at the British Library. I went and lived in a little village in Tanjore for about 3 months, so that I could go daily to the Brihadishwara temple in Tanjore and just get a feel for the place, you know, the landscape, the way the weather feels, and the way the community works and everything like that. So that was really important to me. And I also did one other thing. You know, Devadasi system was outlawed all over India. It's been outlawed. But there are still places where there is a practice that's not exactly like the Devadasis of the temple that I'm writing about, but in North Karnataka, there's a temple to Renuka, and the women are made sexually available through a ritual in the temple. So I went to visit North Karnataka, where that practice is still going on, to talk to those women, because it's the closest I can get to their lived experience. I didn't want to just write from what I read in books. So I went to I spent not a huge amount of time, but they were so incredibly open, and we spent hours talking to each other, and they talked to me about what it was like, for example, when they were sold to a man and suddenly the man appears and he has sex with them. It's like rape, basically. They were very young girls, and they talked very openly about what that experience was like. And so I was able to put that into the book and use, you know, experiences that I don't have, but I was able to do that through their incredible openness. So that's the kind of, I tried to research everything as thoroughly as I possibly could.
just one second. So when we talk about this practice, of older men claiming the rights to the first night with a young girl, in your book you mention this line. A pundit says this, a priest says this. Sorry. If I was a good man, then what I wanted would also be good. For how could an evil desire ever rise in the midst of my goodness? So if this is a man of God, so how do you think we can tackle parts of religion? I mean this in a historical sense also, I mean this in the present day as well. But how do you think we can go about tackling parts of a religion that we can't endorse morally? Like if you in your being you feel it's wrong, but there's a scripture, there is a tradition that says it's right, it's been done for so many years, it's fine. So how do you think men of God, actually, how do you think men of God specifically can tackle something like that, because they're bound by the code of religion?
I know. I mean, I think this is such a fraught question that each one of us has to come to terms with for ourselves, because society tells us that certain things are okay. And now when we think in terms of the climate crisis, for example, the society is quite fine with us um, uh, using plastic bags to carry our groceries home, and society doesn't say anything about it. But if each one of us doesn't feel that there is something morally wrong about this and take a stand, then what's going to happen? Society will go on as it always has, and probably go into the ground with because of climate change. I'm not saying plastic bags. That's just the example that came to my head. But we live in society, and every day we're faced with choices that we have to make that society tells us are okay, and yet we know that it's leading to a certain place inevitably. And so all these things that society has used to accept and has come to realize is wrong. One is the child marriage used to be completely the norm. My grandmother was married before she was 16. And, yet now nobody would want to marry off their 8-year-old girl. We recognize that there's something wrong with that. And somebody had to be the first person to recognize this is not the right way to go about it. And we recognize that slavery is wrong, and slavery used to be completely acceptable and completely condoned, and now it no longer is. And in the same way, the Devadasi institution, people realized, in fact, the Devadasis themselves, many of them felt that there was something deeply wrong about this. They didn't like how they were treated. They didn't want to go with whatever man their mother for them. And so we can look back and say those were choices they had to make, but we can also recognize that these are choices that we have to make, and that every day we are faced with choices that society thinks are perfectly acceptable, and that yet we have the ability to recognize that there's something we should do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course it does. So actually, this brings me to this, what you mentioned about your research. So if you're interviewing Devdasis of today, I don't understand. Does the law not do anything about it, or what is it? Because ideally, I think it would be pretty transparent that someone is using that girl wrongly. And if you're using religion to mask it, isn't that something they can report to the police?
Yeah,
So,
it is. It is something, and there are NGOs trying to work within that community to end it. But they were explaining to me how difficult it is when the society, when everybody, like the problems are based in poverty. it's only very poor families that give their girls to the temple to be institutionalized. Now, if those families have no choice, if they feel like I have no choice except to do this, otherwise my daughter is going to give her to the temple, and she has a way to make a livelihood, then but then once that's done, and once she's dedicated to the temple, it should be illegal for a man to become her first partner or to become her patron over time. But because it's accepted by the community, it still goes on. And the NGO people were telling me that even when they take the girls out of the practice, they put them into schools, they educate them, they give them into jobs with a proper payment and everything. If any man within that community comes to find out that she was actually dedicated as a Devadasi, they demand that she be available for sex. It doesn't matter what profession she managed to get into. So it's so insidious when the society as a whole doesn't agree that this is a practice. And so you can see that for the men in the community, for the high caste men, this actually gives them young girls who are sexually available, and they wouldn't want to let that go if they can somehow keep it alive. So it's
even when they try to escape, they're not actually escaping it. Even if they go into proper society, it's coming chasing behind them.
Yeah, they told me, they would make the girl a secretary or a receptionist, and then somebody would come to find out that she had actually come from the Devadasi community, and then men would start demanding sex from her. And it was quite tragic, quite sad. You can't just fix one thing, you have to fix the whole system.
So Nagaveni, what I really found very interesting. So you were even talking about this in present day. So Nagaveni is a very interesting creature because she's dedicated both her daughters into Devdasi, being Devdasis, and she's trained them from a very young age, which basically means that she knows what it's for, she knows what she's doing. This is not like a lack of money also. She had a patron, right? Now, when you're dedicating your own daughter into something so inherently evil, even if it's like a different time or a different culture, obviously you have to acknowledge the fact that it's wrong. So how did you go about kind of exploring what their relationship is like? It's such a complicated relationship. The person you're supposed to trust the most is essentially giving you away for a profit. So first of all, how did you go about writing this character? And second of all, how did you did you find like a real life example in your research to kind of base it on? Yeah, I'm asking very complicated questions. I'm really sorry about it. I'm just like a nerd for history, and all this stuff is so interesting. There's small parts of history where it's not written about. So when I get a chance to like talk to someone who's good at it, I just grab it and I like hold on. So
every writer needs readers, and so it's so wonderful to talk to people who are really, really interested in the minutiae. You think that you're putting in the minutiae for your own pleasure, but when it gives pleasure to somebody else, of course, it's very, very exciting. So there was a book written by a Devadasi. Her name is Rama Mirtamal, and the book is called Web of Deceit. It's not a great novel. It's a very polemical novel. It has a point of view that she very much wants to communicate, a very particular kind of message against the Devadasi system, because she was a young girl, and when her mother tried to fix her up with the patron, she actually ran away with her music teacher, and she left the system, and then she was very instrumental in trying to have it abolished. So I read that novel, and I tried to imbue those characters that she knew intimately with my own particular life. But I was very interested to read that book, because it's really the only book written by a Devadasi for and about her own experience. So some of it came from that. Some of it came from the see, I don't think that Nagaveni recognizes the system as evil at all. I don't think she thinks that this is the way things should be. And on the other side of Rama Mritama, there were Devadasis who fought to establish that Devadasi system should continue to exist. And so in the 1920s and 30s, when my novel was being written, there were these two kind of conflicting factions. So there were one, the Devadasis were very proud. They were very proud of their accomplishments, their beauty, their learning, and all the Sthala Puranas of various temples. Almost all of them have a Devadasi somewhere. One story is that the Devadasi's half chewed pan, when she took it out of her mouth and she put it into a man's mouth. This was used to be considered very sexy. I find it so hard to imagine, but it was supposed to be very sexy to chew the pan and then put it into the other person's mouth. But when that happened, the man became a poet. That was she had so much power and so much inherent qualities that she could give the gift of poetry through her half-chewed pan to a man. So a lot of pride was taken in the Devadasi system as well. It wasn't completely, I mean, it allowed this dance form to flourish. That's, you know, the Bharatanatyam really grew within that community to be what it was. And it's the same, again, I have to say, with many art forms in India at the time. Art forms and sexual availability of women, they very often went together. And that artist mentality doesn't maybe take very well to stable marriage, you know, stable monogamous marriage. Maybe there's something there that.
But what I just realized is that the reason, like in a way, it is sort of feminist, because I think Devadasis were probably the only women who actually owned the way they lived, right? They have their own money, they have their own source of income, they control who they are with, they can be alone, they own their own house. And feminist. Oh, 1 second. Yeah, the signal just went away.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I didn't quite get the end of your question, but I think I understand. But so when I was dancing, when I was a Bharatanatyam dancer, before I was a writer, all the padams and javalis of the Bharatanatyam repertoire, they talk about the daily life of Devadasis, basically. You know, they talk about how she goes and meets a man in the forest for a tryst, and how she's unhappy because he's gone to another woman. They talk about her daily routine of dressing herself, and you know, one of the most famous ones is where she says, "Why have you come to my house? Did you make a mistake and mistake it for her house because the moonlight is so bright?" You know, she's sarcastic, and she's alone in a house late at night, and she's letting a man into the house to talk to her. So that all the aspects of her life come through to me in the padams and javalis of my repertoire. I kind of had an idea of what that woman was like. So she was both, I mean, as every woman is, she's both highly individual, and she has her own desires, and she has to negotiate that within a society that has a desire to restrict her in some way. Even books that I would recommend about Devadasi. They're not specific, and you know, you've caught me a little bit by surprise, so I'm not able to. There's Douglas Knight's biography of Bala Saraswati, and I think it's called Bala. And
Okay.
unfortunately, I don't have it in my library, so I can't just run and look at see what it is. But Douglas Knight wrote a biography of Bala Saraswati. And even though many parts of it are not complete, it's more of a hagiography. He glorifies her and her tradition. He doesn't really go, and because he's related to her, I completely understand. And it's quite well written, and it goes into quite a lot of detail on her dance especially. So if you really wanted to understand that. Now, there is a similar book about Gohar Bai. I'm not sure whether I'm pronouncing that properly.
Gohar Bai.
Gohar Bai, yes. And there's a book about her as well. And that's also a really detailed book. And because I've read it so long ago, I can't tell you all the details, but I do remember that it was really, really very affecting and very much influenced how I thought of the tradition. And the books that I'm currently reading for my, so I'm also, I'm working on a sequel to Girl Made of Gold, and it's going to be called The Coral Princess, and it's set within the film industry, because a lot of girls from the Devadasi tradition, once Devadasi was abolished, they went into film, and all the early heroines of early Tamil cinema were from the Devadasi community. I mean, again, that makes perfect sense. The respectable girls wouldn't want to do this, but the Devadasis would be, and they would have the skills to be, and so, you know, there's footage of these women is they're incredibly charismatic and enticing and very, very beautiful as well. So I'm doing research for that book. And in that regard, I'm reading a book by Randor Guy, and it's called Memories of Madras. And it's all about the early film industry. Not, you know, it's a really interesting book. Again, not a perfectly written book or anything like that, but it's full of interesting anecdotes about the early Tamil cinema, and it's absolutely fascinating for that reason. And I'm also reading a book that you said it tells you something about history, but from a different point of view. So it's my absolutely favorite history book, and it's called A Corner of a Foreign Field by Ramachandra Guha, who's an amazing historian and writer. And it's a history of India told through the lens of cricket. And I'm not even a cricket fan, you know, I'm not even a huge cricket fan, But I loved the way of refracting Indian history through this lens, and it's a wonderful book. And so I'm also writing a book on Indian dance, and I want to do it as entertainingly as he has done it. And so I thought, okay, this will be a good example for me. So those are the books I'm reading at the moment.
Absolutely. Awesome.